Greetings and thank you for joining us today, all of you here in person and the many, many of you who are joining us virtually. I'm Linda Tobash, Senior Advisor for Education at the Korea Society, and I'm honored to welcome you to the 2023 Sherman Family Korea Emerging Scholar Lecture. Our program today includes, first, a welcome from Thomas Byrne, who is President and CEO of the Korea Society, and who has taken on the position recently of Honorary Ambassador appointed by the Minister of South Korea, of the South Korean Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy, under the auspices of the KOTRA Invest Korea to help promote trade and investment ties between Korea and the U.S. Coincidentally, Tom served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Changwon County, one of the original 6 industrial complexes at the time of Park Chung-hee's government. So it's very appropriate that Tom will also introduce our 2023 Sherman Family Scholar Lecture Awardee, Dr. Munseob Lee of the University of California, San Diego, and his lecture, The Return of Industrial Policy, Lessons from Korea. After Dr. Lee's lecture, we will be open for questions. And for those of you in the audience, we'll do that. We'll provide you with a mic. Also, for those of you virtually who have a question, you can send those at any time by email to koreansstudies@koreasociety.org. That's Korean Studies, one word, at koreasociety.org. We have received several questions already from registrants, and we will make every effort that we can to address as many questions as possible given our time constraints. The program will conclude with Mrs. Sherman presenting the 2023 Sherman Family Emerging Scholar Lecture plaque. And now it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to Thomas Byrne.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone, both live here and also streaming in for us. Yeah, so thanks for the intro, Toby. Back when I lived in Changwon-gun, the factories hadn't completely overtaken the rice fields, but you could see what was going up in the industrial complex at the time. So I'd like to start by thanking Phil and Birgitta Sherman, whose generous sponsorship makes this lecture series and award possible. Since its inception in 2017, the goal of the competitive lecture award has been to encourage thought leadership on Korea across a range of topics among a new generation of scholars. And it is my pleasure to welcome and congratulate the Society's 2023 Sherman Lecture Awardee, Dr. Munseob Lee, Assistant Professor of Economics at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS, at the University of California, San Diego, where he teaches courses including fiscal and monetary policy, macroeconomics of development, and the Korean economy. Dr. Lee is also an associate director in GPS's Korea Pacific program. He is an economist who concentrates his research efforts on macroeconomics, growth, development, firm dynamics, and Korea, and he's our first economist winner of this award. Dr. Lee's work has been published in the Journal of Political Economy, the Journal of Monetary Economics, among others. He has been a consultant at the World Bank, a visiting fellow at the Asian Development Bank, a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, as well as the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He earned a PhD from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's from Seoul National University. I personally had the opportunity to meet Professor Lee in October when he was a panelist for the U.S. Republic of Korea Alliance at 70, Legacy and Future Symposium, which was jointly hosted by the Korea Society, the Korea Defense Veterans Association, and the Korea Pacific Program, and held at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. In his Sherman Family Lecture, The Return of Industrial Policy, Lessons from Korea, Dr. Lee draws lessons from the Korean experience to provide several insights. First, although the empirical literature remains sparse in this field of industrial policy, he showcases how granular data and contemporary econometric methods can cast light on the costs and benefits of industrial policy. Many government policies do not consider the costs and benefits of such policies. Second, Dr. Lee highlights the potentially mixed impact of industrial policy. And finally, he stresses the importance of implementing industrial policy effectively and to allocate resources judiciously to firms and entrepreneurs who can maximize outcomes. And so let me welcome Dr. Lee to the podium.
Okay, so thank you, Tom, for very generous introduction. First of all, I would like to express the sincere gratitude to the Mr., the Mrs., the Sherman, the Thomas Bond, the Linda Tobash, and the Korea Society team for finding the values from my work and giving me the opportunity to share my work in front of this broad audience. It's my deep pleasure and honor to give the Sherman family lecture today. And the title of the talk is The Return of the Industrial Policy, Lessons from Korea. This clicker is not working. Okay, so the industrial policy is making a comeback. So we see the government interventions not only in China, but also in the US, the Europe, and other Asian countries. It is very interesting to observe the comeback, because we have lived in the era of Washington Consensus that is represented by the deregulation and liberalization. Though nowadays we see the series of the industrial policy even in the US, that we can find those from in Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act. The natural question is, so what do we know about the effectiveness of the industrial policies from the past experience in the US or in other countries? So I will talk about the three major themes in today's lecture. The first one is, why is it challenging to study effectiveness of the industrial policy? Why we still don't have a consensus in academia whether the industrial policy is effective or not? In the second part, I will talk about what we learned from the Korean industrial policy during the 1970s. It was the largest scale industrial policy targeting heavy and chemical industries. And the last part, I will talk about what are the new challenges for today's industrial policy, especially in the US, facing the globalized world. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the part one of the lecture, I will talk about the two major challenges behind studying the effectiveness of the industrial policy. The first one is identification, and the second one is the data availability. So let me first talk about the issue of identification. So in the social science, natural science, and medicine, so we want to compare the performance of the treatment by giving this treatment only to the treatment group, but having the control group getting the placebo one. So we have a treatment group and the control group, and we compare whether the treatment is effective. That's what we basically did when we developed the COVID-19 vaccine. That's the ideal situation, but the problem is that in the industrial policy, it is extremely difficult to randomize the policy interventions. So instead, the social scientists, including myself, we rely on so-called the natural experiment, where the sectors are chosen by the non-economic regions. So then if the sectors are chosen by the non-economic regions, like the US is choosing the semiconductor industry for the defense, the security-related regions. So then it's somewhat exogenous and somewhat random. So then we can really tell about the effectiveness of the industrial policy. So that's the first challenge. And the second challenge is the data availability. So I just talked about the first challenge about the identification, and the second challenge is about the data availability. So again, it would be ideal to compare the treated firms and the non-treated firms before and after the policy. But the firm level data is confidential. It's not readily available, especially for the historical episodes. So as a social scientist, we rely on the administrative data collected by the government or proprietary data collected by the private company like the credit rating agency. So when I studied the effectiveness of the Korea's industrial policy during the 1970s, so we rely heavily on the administrative data provided by the South Korean government, covering both the before and after the industrial policy. So given these two empirical challenges the social scientists face to talk about the effectiveness of the industrial policy, so I will introduce my recent work on the Korean industrial policy during the 1970s. Let me give you some context. So this is the 1973 to 1979, the heavy and chemical industry drive under President Park Chung-hee government. Let me first tell you how we overcame two challenges I just described. The first on identification. During this industrial policy period, the industries and the regions were chosen by some non-economic regions. The first to modernize the military industries facing the threat coming from the North Korea, and second to boost the export because the Korean government wanted to follow what Japan did. So Japan grew by investing on the light industries during the 1950s and successfully transformed its economy toward export-oriented heavy and chemical industries during the 1960s. So President Park Chung-hee had that observation. We can see that from his conversation with his economic advisor a year before the introduction of the industrial policy. So it was very natural for the Park Chung-hee government to choose those sectors and then focusing on the export instead of doing the import, the substitution. So this part of the lecture will heavily rely on my recent working paper, written with the Dr. Min-ho Kim at the Korea Development Institute and Professor Yong-Suk Shin at the Washington University in St. Louis. So let me give you some background about this industrial policy. So through the October Restoration in 1972, the President Park Chung-hee assumed the dictatorial powers. So back then, the President Park Chung-hee didn't have enough support in the National Assembly to extend his presidential term once again. So when he started his third presidential term, so he decided to dissolve the National Assembly and declare the martial law. So it was self-coup. 2 months after the October Restoration, the President Park Chung-hee announced the industrial policy. So these are the sentences from his speech in the New Year's, New Year's speech. The government is announcing the heavy and chemical industry project. From now on, the government will accelerate the promotion of the HCI, such as steel, shipbuilding, and petrochemical industries, and thereby increase their exports. And there were two primary motivations. The first was security-driven. So the government wanted to modernize its military industry to address North Korea's series of the attacks and the military escalation. And that was during the Nixon administration. And by the end of the Vietnam War, the Nixon administration was proposing the plan to withdraw the US troops from the Korean Peninsula, which fortunately didn't happen, but it was real threat. The US government, considering to withdraw the US troops from the Korean Peninsula, and then the threat from the North Korea. Back then, the North Korea's the GDP per capita was slightly higher than the South Korea's the GDP per capita. So this threat was real. And the second motivation was the export promotion with the specific target, the target annual export of the 10 billion the US the dollars, the following the Japanese the growth model. And this is the pamphlet, the advertising, the industrial policy. So you see the three numbers from this pamphlet, the 10, 100, and 1,000. So let me tell you what those mean. The 10 means October, the restoration. 100 means $10 billion export. And 1,000 means the $1,000 the GDP per capita. And you see the picture describing the good quality of the light, the back then. So you see the people watching TV inside the house, the tractor, the symbol of the modernized the agriculture, and the two cars coming into the house. All of those, the average the Korean household didn't have back then. But it was describing what the government wanted to achieve as an outcome of industrial policy. So there were three major policy instruments, the supporting the development of the specific set of the industries and specific set of the regions. The first policy instrument was the changing effective tax rate. So I'm showing you the effective tax rates for the 9 industries before and after the industrial policy period. So before the industrial policy, there was not much difference across the industries in their effective tax rate entrepreneurs are facing. But during the industrial policy period, the government decreased the effective tax rate in 3 industries: chemical, the primary metal, and fabricated metal machinery and equipment, the basically heavy and the chemical industries. Another interesting observation from this figure is that at the same time, the government increased the effective tax rate for light industries. So this industrial policy was discriminating against the non-targeted industries. So by doing so, the industrial policy in Korea was somewhat self-financed. So it's very costly. Industrial policy is very costly. It is always the question, where do we get that money? So the part of the industrial policy in Korea was self-financed by charging the higher price on the light industries. So by giving this menu toward the entrepreneurs, the Samsung Hyundai, the Samsung was producing cement and the sugar before this industrial policy. So it was very natural for the entrepreneurs to move to the heavy and the chemical industries that are heavily supported by the government, from the light industry that is somewhat discriminated by the government new policy. And the second policy instrument was the loan made by the Korea Development Bank, which is the state-owned bank. So before the industrial policy period, I'm showing you the total loan amount in the current Korean won value. There was no difference between the heavy and chemical industries and other manufacturing industries, but you see that the gap started getting widened during the industrial policy period. So the state-owned bank provided the loan with the lower interest rate, heavily focusing on the heavy and the chemical industries during this period. And the last policy instrument was constructing industrial complexes. So the Korea originally chose the 6 locations, and during the industrial policy period, the government built the 9 industry complexes, all of them inside the Gyeongsang province. That has an advantage. It is close to the proximity to the largest port, which is Busan, and the Gyeongsang province was the President Park Chung-hee's the hometown. So I'm showing you the picture of Changwon, so where the Thomas Won served as the Peace Corps during the industrial policy period. So I'm showing you the picture in the 1974 and in the 1976. In 1974, it was empty land. So there was nothing there, and this is the picture on the location, the same area. So within 2 months, the factories has been built, and the workers started producing the machinery, the products inside the factory. And this industrial policy ended unexpectedly after the assassination of the President Park in October 1979. And the new military junta wanted to differentiate from the previous regime, and they pushed for the so-called rationalization, using the private sector-led growth as its new slogan. And by doing so, the new military junta, led by the next president, President Chun Doo-hwan, blamed the economic contraction in the 1980, which was the first negative growth since the Korean War, on the Park's HCI policy, even though that short-term recession came from the second oil shock. So to study this effectiveness of this, I will say the short-living industrial policy for 6 to 7 years, so we employed the difference in differences, the methodology, which is widely used in social science. The idea is that we compare the average change over time in the outcome variable for the treated industries and regions to the change for the non-treated ones, replicating what natural science and the medicine are doing inside the lab, having the treatment group and the control group, and we are tracking the change in the performance between these two groups. Let me summarize our main findings. So we have 2 major findings. The first, we found that the targeted industry region pair grew significantly faster in terms of output, input, and labor productivity. So that means the industrial policy was effective at making the strategically important sector larger. But we found something else. The second finding is that the degree of the misallocation of the resources across the plants increased in the targeted ones. So meaning that we have seen the overall increase in the output, but when we looked at the plant level data, the unproductive ones grew faster than the productive ones, meaning that the scarce resources, the capital and the labor, has been more and more allocated to the unproductive farms and the plants. And that also increased the degree of the concentration. So that means the South Korea could have done better if they found the alternative, the way of allocating these resources towards the most productive farms in the economy. So what Korea did was providing the subsidy to the handful amount of the entrepreneurs who already had a political connection before the implementation of the industrial policy. So maybe that was the second best policy because the Korea back then didn't have a well-established the market economy or the financial sector where we can evaluate the productivity or potential of the universe of the firms. But now thinking about the industrial policy in the US, we can do better. I mean, we don't have to rely on the political connections we have. And then we can use the more market-driven allocation, the mechanism that would maximize the benefit of the industrial policy. So our first finding is about the benefit of the industrial policy, and then the second finding is more about the cost of industrial policy. The policy was successful at making a strategically important sector the larger. And then the next question is, what is special in Korea? Because we have seen the similar industrial policies in Latin American countries or other Asian countries. We know the stories of the failures. That's why the US pushed for the Washington Consensus starting from early 1990s. I want to make the points. The first one is that it had a clear export orientation. By following what Japan did. And this is differentiated from the series of the policies implemented in the Latin American countries, the mainly focusing on the import substitution. So instead of doing that, the import substitution, you basically support the domestic, the companies to do better job in the domestic market, making domestic firms the competitive in the domestic market. So what Korea did was, okay, so the supporting the Korean firms, but the goal was the making them competitive in the global market. And the second point is that the government led the drive, but left its implementation towards the private sector, which is differentiated from the series of the industrial policy, the recent ones in China. So where the majority of the implementation was made by the state-owned enterprises. So typically, the less productive than the enterprises. And the third one is that it took the government budget constraint into consideration. So I see that the inflation increased and then the government that increased during this period, but those macroeconomic risk was managed under the control. And partly because it was somewhat self-financed by increasing the revenue from the light industries and supporting towards the strategically important sectors. But still, the policy could have been the more successful if the subsidies were allocated toward the most productive firms instead of the government relying heavily on the political connections they had in the industries that has been already developed before this policy, which is the light manufacturing. So for remaining the 10 minutes or so I will talk about the new challenges for today's industrial policy, especially in the US. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, we expect to spend roughly the $1 trillion US dollar. 80% of the spending goes on the domestic energy security and climate change, mostly the batteries and electronic vehicles. And under Chips and Science Act, we expect to spend roughly the $280 billion US dollar in domestic research and manufacturing of semiconductors. But when US designed the industrial policy these days, so there are many other factors we have to consider. So it's more complicated than the Korea in the 1970s, which is the small open economy, and its industrial policy doesn't affect much its trading partner. But nowadays, US is very different. So we have seen some retaliation by our trading partners, including Korea. The Korea's responses against those two major industrial policies could be summarized by two keywords. The first, dispute, and second, cooperation. Let me first talk about the dispute. Under the IRA, to get a tax credit, the substantial portion of the electronic vehicles must be produced within the United States. And that's the IRA's discriminatory, the local content provisions for electronic vehicles. I mean, this is for sure the violation of the WTO's free trade rule. When this policy was announced, many people were surprised, including myself and including the majority of the South Korean. So the South Korea felt betrayed. 4 months after the introduction of 4 months after passing the bill, the Treasury clarified that the IRA's commercial clean vehicle tax credits are available to consumers who lease vehicles. So basically opening the loopholes. So right after this announcement, the CEO of the Hyundai, so the producer of the electronic vehicle, the Korean company, made an announcement that they are going to expand this leasing business. So they did that. It was the under 5%, the leasing, the share, out of the new car purchases in Hyundai, and now that share increased from the less than 5% to over 30%. Even with providing this loophole, in early 2023, the Korean government implemented its own industrial policy for the EV plants and the battery industry. And it is extremely important to find the cooperation, the partnership with our allies. And by providing this loophole, the next figure I'm showing you is the US imports of the electronic vehicles coming from 3 countries. The red line is the Korea, blue line is Japan, and the yellow line is China. So by providing the loophole, the US was able to manage the big concern at the beginning under the control, because you see that the steady increase in the red line, which is the US import of the EVs coming from Korean firms, the Hyundai and Kia. And the second reaction was cooperation. So the IRA provides the tax credits and other incentives. So given this, the Korean companies have made a significant investments into clean energy manufacturing, mostly the batteries and EVs inside the United States. And these are the list of the manufacturing investment announcements, sorted by the size of the promised investment. And I'm showing you the top 10 investments announced after the IRA became effective. And you will see the name of the Korean companies. The top one is the LG Energy Solution, Korean firm. Second one is the Hyundai and SK, their joint the venture, which is the Korean firm. Third one is the Toyota, Japanese. Honda and LG Energy Solution, the joint venture of the US, the Japanese, and the Korean firm. And the top 10 one, number 10 is the GM and the Samsung SDI, the joint venture between the US and Korean firms. And you also see the second last column is the number of the job. So the factories are expected to hire. So these new factories will create the new jobs within the state. So the industrial policy will create the jobs, but the remaining question is, would it increase the productivity and the long-run growth? So we are making the huge amount of the investment, the $1 trillion and the $280 billion to promote the strategically important sectors. So in my view, if it only increases the level of the GDP, if you ask me, I will say that that's the failure of the industrial policy. It's too costly. So I think the goal of the industrial policy should be more about promoting the productivity and the long-term growth of those strategically important sectors. So in that sense, I think the US and our allies, including Korea for sure, as an important partner, so the future of our collaboration in the economics area should be centered around the collaboration in the research and development in the critical technologies. The reason why is that the Korea and the US have a complementary capabilities. For example, in the semiconductor industry, the US is the world best in designing the advanced chips, and then the Korea is the world best in producing the DRAMs and certain types of the semiconductors. I mean, there's no reason to make this the redundant investments. The current industrial policy, retaliation, and many countries are entering to the subsidy races. So we see the series of the investment targeting exactly the same type of the technology. So if we can cooperate, even though it's challenging, it will reduce the redundant investment. It will reduce the waste of the scarce resources. I find some opportunity because we already see the joint ventures in production. I showed you the example of the GM and Samsung, the pulling together to produce the strategically important products. Then why not in the research and development? So let me summarize my lecture and give you the 3 takeaways. I'm cautiously optimistic about the future of the industrial policy. Though we see more and more the scientific evidence on the effectiveness of the industrial policy, by revisiting the historical episodes, including my own work revisiting the case of the Korea, by overcoming the 2 challenges we have been facing, the identification and the data. So we are collecting the more and more information, the more empirical evidence on the how much and the why the certain industrial policy has been successful and others were not. And this Korea's case emphasized the importance of the how to implement the policy. So these days, the China is doing it, US is doing it, the Korea is doing it. It's not a question anymore whether your country would push for the industrial policy. There is no choice. You are doing it. But then the much more important question for us to ask is how to implement the industrial policy and how to maximize the benefit of the huge investment into the specific set of the sectors. And as I emphasized at the last part of my lecture, in a globalized world, the design of the industrial policy became much more complicated. And from the scholars, the point, we don't have many empirical evidence yet, because the landscape and environment, when the countries implemented industrial policy was different from what we are facing these days. Still, we have to draw the lessons from the historical episode, but we have to take that into consideration that we are facing the new set of the challenges. So in that sense, I really appreciate this chance to present my work. So I'm basically showing you the scholar's view, understanding on the industrial policy, but whenever I have chance, I'm very willing to hear from the practitioners who really have a great insight about the series of the challenges the scholars are missing by studying some historical episodes. Okay, so I will wrap up my lecture here, and I'm very looking forward to having the conversation during the Q&A session. Thank you.
So is there anyone who has a question for Dr. Lee? From the audience. Okay, we'll take you. Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, Steve Cargman Associates. My question is, you mentioned that Korea looked to Japan as a model for industrial policy. In Japan, they had a coordinating agency, as you know, MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. I'm wondering whether Korea had something comparable as a coordinating agency, similar to MITI.
Yeah, thank you for the great question. Yes, so Korea had the Ministry of the Economic Planning, which was heavily monitored by the Korean version of the White House, the Blue House, under the President Park Chung-hee. So this industrial policy, the government back then didn't have much the problem of the coordination, because there was the one dedicated agency in the government in charge of the promoting multiple industries at the same time. But this is a great question, because that's the challenge the Chinese government is facing these days. Because what China did was delegating some of the design and then implementation of the industrial policy, depending on the sector, the multiple agencies that participated in, and then they found the challenge, the coordinating the multiple agencies, making this industrial policy more effective. So the Japan and the Korea is showing the one case where the centralized the design and the implementation has been effective, the promoting the multiple, which could be potentially competitive to each other, the industries at the same time effectively together.
We have another one here, but I'm thinking just to make sure that we get in speakers who, okay, we'll take him first.
Yeah, Ricardo Tavares. I'm head of semiconductor policy at Google. I think one interesting aspect that you raised, and I want to confirm if I understood correctly, is that the 1970s HCI policy was primarily for Korean companies to receive the subsidies, because I think we have cases that the incentives of the policy, the industrial policy, are exclusively for domestic companies, even if they are export-oriented, as opposed to be open to more about the localization of that production in the country, independent of where that company is headquartered. If you look at the IRA, the list you showed include companies, the leading companies actually are not American companies that are receiving the incentives, and we have different cases around the world. I just want to clarify on whether you think a policy effectiveness can be affected if it's focused only on domestic players, or it's more open to foreign companies as well.
That's a great point. So let me clarify that during this industrial policy period, the all subsidies, I will say, yeah, I can say that the majority of the subsidy went to the domestic company. It didn't go to the multinational corporations, the opening the branch inside the Korea. But at the same time, the reason why the other countries brought the branch of the multinational corporation is because the domestic companies do not have a necessary the technology. So what Korea did was the complementing the subsidy toward the domestic companies. The Korea made the dedicated agencies the promoting the technology adoption. So the Korean government played like a matchmaker. The Samsung purchased the technology from the Japanese companies and the US companies back then. But to purchase the technologies, you have to show that you will pay the royalty. So the government provided the insurance. So so I'm a matchmaker. So the government was in the table for the conversation, the technology, the transfer from the Japanese companies to the Korean companies. So that's how the Korea imported technology, and then the developing the production of that within the domestic companies, without the bringing the multinational corporations into the Korean peninsula. So it's a controversial which the policy will be more effective in general, but at least in the case of the Korea, it has been successful because even after the end of the industrial policy, domestic companies stayed in Korea. The biggest concern, the supporting the multinational corporation, is that after the end of the industrial policy, they may have an incentive to close the branch within the country. So that has happened in certain cases. That didn't happen in Korea because it was all the domestic companies who got the subsidies.
Do we have any other audience questions?
Yeah, I have one. It's Tom Byrne, former resident of Chongwon County. Yeah, I was thinking this is a fascinating topic, particularly how do we apply Korea's experience in the 1970s? And you mentioned that even though Chun Doo-won started a new policy, essentially Korean economic industrial policy, at least the institutional setup with the linkage between the banks, the Jabil, and the government continued until the IMF crisis, when the heavily indebted corporations couldn't get finance anymore because it was indebted industrialization, another way the way I put it. So I'll get to my question in a second. I was reading the St. Louis Fed wrote a piece called "The Pitfalls of Industrial Policy," and I thought, well, that's very relevant. And then I looked at the date; it was published 20 years ago in 1993. But they point out that governments don't have a really good record on picking winners and choosers, winners and losers, I should say. Even MITI discouraged Honda from producing automobiles and discouraged Sony from producing consumer electronics. So, isn't it still true that, the individual entrepreneurs and firms are better equipped to make the choices of where to allocate resources? And so my question is really, was Korea's success really because industrial policy substituted for the lack of markets? And also a complete de-emphasis on profitability was all on expansion and catching up with Japan. So nowadays, where you could argue we're not going for growth at the expense of profitability, but the choice is between purpose and profits, perhaps, in choosing which type of green energies to produce. So are the basic economic conditions and circumstances different now that could make you perhaps more cautious and optimistic on whether industrial policy will succeed today?
Okay, so thank you for great questions and the comments. So it's so true that when the Korea developed its economy, the Korea didn't have the market mechanism to allocate the subsidies appropriately to the most productive firms. So that's the part of my finding, showing that the Korea could have done the better by choosing the most productive ones. But thinking about the case of the US today, still it is the government's role to allocate the resources across the sectors. So it's totally possible that there is the one sector that requires the huge amount of the investment from the one entrepreneur's perspective. It's not an optimal to make an investment, but the social benefit from that investment could be higher than the individual benefit. So that's the textbook case where the government should intervene and correct the market failure. So in that sense, it is totally the valid, the government, the allocating the resources toward the sector where they see the underinvestment due to this market failure. But after making that allocation of the decision toward a specific sector, the allocation of the resource toward a specific firm within the sector, I think it will be the best if this is driven by the market, the mechanism. So say for example, the Department of Energy, so in the US, when they provide the R&D, the grants, so they basically solicitate the applications, and then the technicians comes and they make the ranking, and they choose, say, 10 out of the 100 applications. So it's not really the market mechanism, but the technician comes and evaluate the proposal, they make a ranking, and they provide the subsidies toward the most productive applicants. So that's something that any country can do if they have a trust on the technicians, the government officials, who can choose the best the entrepreneurs instead of giving the higher score on someone they know. So again, it's the government's role to allocate the resources across sector, but the allocation of the resource toward the specific firm within the sector. So we have to rely on some market mechanism or even the scores made by the ranked by the technicians, the objective technicians.
Thanks very much. Munseob, this is Jonathan Karada from the Korea Study. One of the other big differences between the historical era and today is the geopolitics, right? Because back then we were in a bifurcated world, still Cold War economy, global economy. And nowadays it's a globalized economy, and the purpose of a lot of this industrial policy is not only to develop our own capacity in certain critical technologies, but also to prevent adversaries from beating us to the punch in things like chips and batteries, et cetera. So I wonder if you could just chat a little bit about how this geopolitical context difference either complicates our ability to derive lessons from the historical period, or if we're nonetheless able to get some of those lessons.
Sure. So that's why I prepared the last part of the lecture, which was not actually originally inside the lecture proposal when I sent my application toward the lecture, the competition. Exactly because of the reason that you just mentioned, because we are facing the new set of the challenges because the industrial policies are driven by the geopolitical the regions. So we cannot solely rely on the case of the Korea, but it is really similar to the how we take the business cases. So in the business school, we study the cases of the GM, we study cases of the Intel, but do we expect that we can apply the same business strategies in the startup these days? Answer is no, but there are several lessons we can learn from there. It's the same. So the social scientists, including myself, are revisiting the cases, and there are some lessons we can draw, but we have to take into account the similarities and the differences between today's landscape and then the environment back then in the historical the episodes. Let me just add the one more thing. So it's so true that the industrial policies, the targeting the specific the competitors in the global market, which is China this time, the U.S. industrial policy. So even though the U.S. industrial policy may slow down the growth of the China or its catch up, it's impossible to prevent the China from the catching up. Because if the U.S. decide not to sell the strategically important technology toward the China may purchase the similar or slightly worse technology from other countries, including Korea. So it may slow down the catching up of the China, but the U.S. industrial policy may give us some time to slow down its the catching up. So that's also why I think it is extremely important to think about whether the industrial policy can boost the productivity of the U.S. and our allies, including the Korea. So the cooperation between the U.S. and our allies are the key to maximize the benefit of the industrial policy these days.
Anyone else? I know, Tom, we got a number of questions from folks who were sent in earlier questions.
Okay. Yeah, we have one question that I have. It's from Tim Ferguson, who's now the editor at ETC. So his question is, what special role did the family conglomerate tradition play in the Korean experience of industrial policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the U.S. industrial policy is implemented by the private companies. The Chinese industrial policy is implemented by the state-owned enterprises. The Korea's industrial policy was implemented at the end by the family-owned business groups. So in my understanding, the family-owned business group, so-called the JEBR, it's something between the state-owned enterprises and the private companies. So the reason why the Korea focused on the specific handful amount of the entrepreneurs was because that's the information the Korean government had. So they already had a political connection before the policy, and subsidies went to the subset of the entrepreneurs, potentially productive entrepreneurs in Korea. So what Korea didn't expect, I will say, is the succession of the family-owned business groups. So maybe the Korean government didn't expect that in 30 years or 50 years from now on, the sons and daughters of these productive, the ambitious entrepreneurs would still lead that big business group. That's something I think the Korean government didn't anticipate, and that was the unintended negative effect on the Korea's market economy, because nowadays economic power is heavily concentrated within the big business groups, and they are exploiting the market powers they have. And then the son and the grandson, the daughters and granddaughters of the original ambitious, the most productive entrepreneurs back then are not guaranteed to be the most ambitious and the productive entrepreneurs available these days.
We have another question that was sent in. So this is from Tim Wendt at Columbia University. And his question is, Korean industrial policy was very active and very successful in Korea's very rapid modernization, heavily reliant on nurturing the J-ball. So the question is, the Korean government has never really abandoned industrial policy. Do you agree?
So I will say yes. And I will also say that the US never abandoned the industrial policy. So even though the magnitude of the industrial policy fluctuated over time, industrial policy is everywhere in every single period. It is the matter of how much resources we want to allocate toward the policy. The government is intervening everywhere, and it is the necessary whenever they find the market failure. So we have several of the public companies in the electricity or the infrastructure where if you leave the operation of the infrastructure toward the private company, so the one monopolistic could come out and then exploit the market power. So government has been intervening. So it's so true that the South Korean government never abandoned the industrial policy, but I will say the US never abandoned the industrial policy, but there was some fluctuations, the emphasizing its importance or not.
What about Korea? You said the U.S.
The Korea. So during the 1980s, so that was the Chun Doo-han, the Roh Tae-woo administration, pushing more forward the private sector-led growth. But that was the level of the government intervention was still higher than what the U.S. would expect. I mean, by looking at the slogan. So it was after the Asian financial crisis of the 1997 when IMF decided to lend the money to overcome the financial crisis. They came with the packages. They came with a set of the recommendations to make the South Korean the economy more market friendly. So there was some structural change after the 1997. After that, the South Korean government had the moderate level of the industrial policy, but nowadays we also see the rise of the industrial policy in Korea. So under the competition against China and under the competition against the US too, because the new industrial policy introduced in early 2023 was the retaliation against the IRA and the CHIPS and the Science Act. So many countries, including the Korea and US, are now participating in these subsidy races.
I think we have one final question. So I think this is in line with one of the recommendations you make in your paper, that government should carefully consider the costs and benefits of industrial policy before they implement industrial policies. So this is from Marjorie Muriong of La Trobe University in Manila. So what does Professor Lee know about the state of support for these industrial policies from the broader South Korean society? I think this is back in the 70s and 80s. Did the benefits render these policies acceptable or legitimate to the average South Korean despite the costs? That's her question.
That's a great question. I wish I had the answer. But yeah, I mean, I'm also very curious. I have to check the poll results, how the South Korean and the US, the people are thinking about the industrial policy. But my paper is showing the both benefit and the cost of the industrial policy. The one cost I didn't mention much, but that has been emphasized during the Q&A is the rise of concentration and the rise of the chaebols, the family-owned business groups. So I will say the South Korean view is equally divided. I mean, the part of the people believing the benefit of the industrial policy and part of the people paying the higher weight on the cost of the industrial policy. I don't think the South Korean people is the overall the supportive toward the industrial policy, but I wish I knew better, so I have to check the poll results.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Lee. And at this time, I'd like to invite Brigitte up to the stage to present our plaque.
Thank you.
And on that note, we conclude our program. And again, we thank Dr. Lee very, very much, not just for this lecture, but for his research and for his contributions to the field. They're invaluable, and we're glad that that you applied for this program and are continuing your research, and that we've been able to identify your talent for the future. And for those of you who are aspiring scholars and researchers, our next competition for the 8th annual Sherman Family Lecture Award will open in March of 2024. And I invite you to visit our website so that you can get the information as we get closer to that date, but also to visit our website so that you can see lectures from the past. They're all posted on our YouTube station under our Sherman Family Korea Emerging Scholar Lecture Program. And as Tom had mentioned earlier, we really invite applications from applicants who are delving into a range of topics. So as you can see, Dr. Lee is our first economist, but we've had musicians, pansori singers. We've had landscape architectures exploring DMZ landscape use in terms of ways to use the land, but also ways to open up communication with the North. Topics on national identity. We've had a couple of those focus on that. So we do welcome topics from different fields. And so I thank you for joining us, and I wish you all a good rest of your day or evening, depending on your location. Good night.